Meg Doyle stood at the gate of the Rourke ranch with a baby on her hip, and 3 more children lined up behind her, and Meg said the number out loud, the way she always said it, to get it over with before anyone could pretend not to have noticed. "I will be plain with you, Mr. Rourke," Meg said. "I have 4 mouths to feed, and no husband to help me feed them. 4. A man of 9, a girl of 7, a boy of 6, and this baby who is not yet 3. No land, no money, and 4 children who are none of them yours. I know what that adds up to. I have done the sum 100 times. No man wants a woman who comes with 4. So say it now, and I will take my children back down that road, and we will call it no harm done." Meg Doyle was 30 years old. Meg was a widow, and Meg had learned to say the number first, 4, always 4, because the number was the thing people saw before they saw her, and she would rather hand it over herself than watch a man's face do the arithmetic in front of her. Jonah Rourke stood on the other side of the gate and listened to Meg Doyle count her children like a debt she was confessing, and when Meg was done, Jonah did not do the sum she expected. Jonah Rourke looked at the 4 children, and then Jonah looked back at Meg, and Jonah said, "Mrs. Doyle, I think you have counted wrong. You keep saying 4, but if you and these children were to come and sit at my table, that would be 5 of you. 5. And my table, Mrs. Doyle, was built for 6, and it has sat with 5 of its chairs empty for a long, long time. So the way I count it, you are not 4 mouths I would have to feed. You are 5 chairs I have been waiting to fill." Meg Doyle stood very still at the gate. The baby on her hip, whose name was Rose, reached out toward the tall, quiet man as babies do, without any fear, and Jonah let the small hand catch his finger. But Meg did not soften, because Meg had heard kind words before, at the start, and Meg had learned that kind words at the gate have a way of running out somewhere past the door, once a man truly understands what 4 children in a house actually means. The eldest boy, the one of 9, was named Tom. Tom Doyle stood at his mother's shoulder with his jaw set, watching Jonah Rourke the way a boy watches a man he has decided not to trust, because Tom had been the man of the family since his father died, and Tom had learned that grown men who smiled at his mother usually stopped smiling once they counted the children. The girl of 7 was Katie, and the boy of 6 was Danny, and the baby was Rose, and Tom stood in front of all 3 of them like a small, tired soldier guarding a line. I want you to notice the thing that is really happening at this gate, because it is the whole of the story. Jonah Rourke has just told Meg Doyle that her 4 children are not a debt but a blessing, not a subtraction but exactly the addition his empty house has needed. And Meg does not believe him. Meg has spent 2 years being taught that 4 children make a woman unmarriageable, and a person cannot accept a gift they are certain will be taken back the moment it gets heavy. So this is the story of a widow who counted her children as the reason no one would want her, and a man whose long table had waited years for exactly the number she was ashamed of, and of how Meg Doyle finally learned to stop doing the sum that always came out at 4. Remember the table. Remember the 6 chairs, and the 5 that had stood empty so long. We will come back to that table, and to the last empty chair, before we are through. To understand why Meg Doyle counted her children like a debt, you have to know what the last 2 years had taught her. So let me take you back a little, before we go forward. Meg Doyle had been married to a good man named Michael Doyle, a miner, in a small Iowa town where the men went down into the earth for coal and did not always come back up. Michael and Meg had 4 children in 9 years, and they were poor, but they were happy in the ordinary way, and the little house was full and loud and warm. Then, 2 years before this story, the earth took Michael Doyle, the way it took miners, in a collapse in the low gallery that killed 3 men in an afternoon, and Meg Doyle was left a widow at 28, with 4 children under 9, and almost nothing else. What came after was the hard schooling that taught Meg her sum. Because a widow with 4 children is, in the plain reckoning of a poor town, a problem. Meg took in washing and sewing, and it was never enough. And the few men who came around, after a decent time, all did the same thing, every one of them. They would be kind to Meg at first, and then, one by one, they would notice the children. Meg watched it happen so many times, she could have told you the exact moment it came. A man would be sitting at her table, being warm, and then Danny would knock something over, or the baby would cry, or all four would need something at once. And Meg would see the man's eyes move around the room and count. 1, 2, 3, 4. And after a man counted, he did not come back. There was one in particular, a widower with a good farm, who had courted Meg for nearly 2 months, and had seemed, for a while, like he might truly stay. And then one evening, with all 4 children sick and fretful at once, Meg had watched this man stand up from her table and reach for his hat, and Meg had heard him say the thing that finished her. He said, "Meg, you are a fine woman, but 4 is a great many children for a man to take on that aren't his own. I have to think of myself." And he put on his hat and went. And Meg Doyle stood in her doorway and understood, once and for all, exactly what she was worth on the open market. A fine woman, -4. And the 4 always won. So Meg had made the number her armor. She had decided that if the 4 was going to be the thing that sent every man away, then she would say the 4 first, out loud, at the gate, before a man could get warm and then cold. It hurt less that way. It was the only mercy Meg could give herself, to hand over the sum before anyone could do it to her face. That is why Meg counted her children out loud to Jonah Rourke like a confession. She was not being honest. She was flinching first. Now let me tell you about Jonah Rourke, and about the table with 6 chairs, because Meg did not understand him at all, and the misunderstanding is the heart of everything. Jonah Rourke was 35 years old, and Jonah ran a good ranch outside Prairie Grove, and Jonah had built his own house with his own hands 10 years before, when he was young and newly married, and certain of the life ahead of him. Jonah had built that house for a big family. He had built the rooms wide and the hearth deep. And Jonah had built, with particular care, a long kitchen table, out of good oak, with 6 chairs around it, because Jonah had grown up an only child in a quiet house, and had promised himself that his own house would be loud and full, with children enough to fill every chair and more. Jonah had married a woman named Helen, and in the first year, Helen had carried their first child. And Helen and the baby had both died in the birth, on a winter night, with the doctor 2 hours too far away, and Jonah Rourke had buried his wife and his child in the same small grave, and had come home to a house he had built for a big family, with a table built for 6, and no one to sit in any of the chairs but himself. That was 9 years before Meg Doyle came to his gate. 9 years Jonah Rourke had lived alone in a house built for many. 9 years he had sat down to supper at a long oak table with 6 chairs and filled exactly one of them. Jonah had everything a man was supposed to want: the land, the house, the good table. And Jonah would have traded the whole of it for the sound of children loud enough to need every chair. Remember Helen and the baby and the 5 empty chairs. When Jonah Rourke looked at Meg Doyle counting 4 children like a debt, Jonah did not see a debt. Jonah saw his empty chairs, and he saw, walking up his road, the exact family his house had been built, and then left waiting for. Meg Doyle came to work at the Rourke ranch first, before there was any talk of anything more, because Meg was too proud to be courted and too poor to refuse honest work. Jonah needed a housekeeper, or said he did, and Meg needed wages and a roof, and so Meg and the 4 children moved into the wide house that had waited 9 years to be full, and the chairs began, one by one, to fill. Meg meant to keep the children small and quiet, and out of Jonah's way. That was her plan, the same plan she always made, to make 4 children take up as little room as 4 children possibly could, so that Jonah would not count them and turn cold. But a house built for a big family has a way of undoing that kind of plan, and so, despite Meg, the children spread out into the wide rooms and the loud life the house had been built for, and Jonah Rourke, watching it, looked like a man hearing music he had given up on hearing again. It was baby Rose who filled the first chair, in the most literal way. Rose was not yet 3, and Rose had decided, from the moment Jonah let her catch his finger at the gate, that this large, quiet man belonged to her. Rose followed Jonah. Rose reached for Jonah, and at the very first supper, Rose, too small to understand plans about staying out of the way, climbed up into one of the empty chairs at the long oak table, right at Jonah's elbow, and banged her small hand on the wood and demanded to be part of things. Meg moved to take her down, apologizing already. And Jonah Rourke said, "Leave her be, Mrs. Doyle. That chair has been empty 9 years. I like the look of it filled." And he cut Rose's food into small pieces without being asked, the way a man does who has wanted to do exactly that for a very long time. Katie filled the next chair, the girl of 7. Katie was a watchful, careful child, quieter than the others, and Katie had a gift Meg had never had the money to feed, which was that Katie loved to draw, on anything, with anything, scratching pictures into the dust and the frost and the margins of the one book they owned. Jonah noticed. Jonah did not make a fuss of it. Jonah simply came back from town one day with a slate and a box of chalk, and set them by Katie's place at the table without a word, and Katie looked at that slate like it was made of gold. And from that day Katie drew at the table every evening, and Jonah kept every slate she filled, wiping them clean only when she asked, and Meg watched this, and did not know what to do with it, because it was not how the counting men behaved. Danny filled his chair through the animals. Danny was 6, and Danny had never in his life been near a horse, or a calf, or a barn cat that he did not immediately love with his whole body, and the Rourke ranch was full of all 3. Jonah, who had done his chores alone for 9 years, suddenly had a small, loud shadow of a boy at his heels from dawn to dark, and Jonah, far from minding, began to slow his work down to a boy's pace, and to explain things, and to hand Danny small jobs a 6-year-old could feel proud of. Meg would look out from the house and see the tall man and the small boy crouched together over some ordinary chore, and something in her chest would ache in a way she did not let herself examine. But Tom did not fill his chair. Tom was the eldest, the one of 9, and Tom was the hardest, and Tom's chair stayed, in a way, the emptiest of all, even when he was sitting in it, because Tom Doyle had been the man of the family for 2 years. Tom had watched his father go into the ground. Tom had watched his mother cry at night when she thought the children were asleep. Tom had watched man after man be warm to his mother, and then count the children and leave. And Tom had decided, somewhere in all that watching, that his job was to protect his mother and his brother and his sisters, and to trust no grown man, ever, because grown men left. So Tom watched Jonah Rourke the way he watched all of them, waiting for the counting, waiting for the cold, waiting for the day this one would leave too. Tom was polite, because his mother had raised him polite. But Tom gave Jonah nothing, and Tom kept himself between Jonah and the younger children, like a small guard who had been on duty too long, and could not remember how to stand down. And Jonah Rourke, who was wiser than he looked, did not push Tom. Jonah did not try to buy the boy with gifts or win him with a show. Jonah simply let Tom watch. Jonah kept being the same man on Friday that he had been on Monday, the man who filled Rose's plate and kept Katie's slates and slowed his chores to Danny's pace, day after day after day. And Jonah let Tom take all the time in the world to see that the same man kept showing up. For a boy who has watched men leave, there is no gift like a man who simply keeps not leaving. Tom did not know that yet, but Tom was watching, and the watching, slowly, was working on him, though he would have died before he admitted it. And through all of it, Meg Doyle would not let herself hope. Meg saw the chairs filling. Meg saw Rose at Jonah's elbow and Katie's slates, and Danny at Jonah's heels. And still Meg waited for the count. Because Meg had seen the warm beginning before, so many times, and Meg had learned that the warm beginning was exactly the thing that came before the cold end, and Meg had decided long ago that it was safer to keep her heart as small and quiet as she kept her children, so that when Jonah Rourke finally did the sum and reached for his hat, it would not take everything she had left. The thing that broke it all open was Tom, and it happened on a hard night in the first winter. And it was the night Meg Doyle was certain, at last, that the counting had come. It started small, the way these things do. Tom, 9 years old and carrying 2 years of being the man of the family, had gotten it into his head that Jonah Rourke was going to send them all away once winter made 4 children too expensive to keep. Tom had heard, somewhere, some talk in town about how hard the winter was going to be, and Tom had done, in his own young way, the same sum his mother always did, and Tom had decided that he would not sit and wait to be sent off. Tom decided he would leave first and go find work and send money home and be the man his father would have wanted and spare his mother the shame of having Jonah Rourke count them and turn cold. So on a bitter night in December, Tom Doyle packed a little bundle and slipped out of the warm house into the dark and the cold to walk to town and find work. A 9-year-old boy alone in an Iowa winter night, trying to save his family by removing himself from the sun. Meg found the empty bed near midnight, and Meg came undone. Because Meg knew that country and that cold, and Meg knew what a winter night could do to a child alone, and every terror a mother carries rose up in her at once. And Meg's second thought, right behind the terror, was the old cruel one. Now Jonah will see. Now Jonah will see what 4 children truly cost. A boy lost in the snow at midnight. Now Jonah Rourke will count us and be done. But Jonah Rourke did not count. Jonah heard Meg's cry and was pulling on his boots before she finished speaking. Jonah did not say one useless word. Jonah said, "Get the others warm and stay by the fire. I know every foot of this country, and Tom does not. I will bring your boy home." And Jonah Rourke went out into the killing cold after a 9-year-old who was not his own, the way a father goes, without a breath of hesitation, and rode the dark, frozen roads calling Tom's name into the wind. Jonah found Tom 2 miles toward town, half frozen and lost, and too proud to turn back, sheltering in the lee of a fence line, where the boy had finally understood that the cold was bigger than his plan. And Jonah Rourke did not scold Tom, and Jonah did not lecture him. Jonah got down off his horse and wrapped the shaking boy in his own coat. And Jonah said, "Your ma is home half out of her mind. Let's get you back to her." And then, as he lifted Tom up onto the horse, Jonah said the thing that finally reached the boy who had trusted no man in 2 years. Jonah said, "I know what you were doing, Tom. You were trying to take yourself out of the count, so your ma would have one less to feed. I know, because I have been watching you do the arithmetic all winter. So let me tell you something, man to man, and then we will never speak of it again. You have got the sum wrong. You are not one more mouth I have to feed. You are the eldest boy in a house that waited 9 years to have any boys in it at all. I do not want you gone, Tom. I want you home. Now let's go, before your mother has my hide." Something broke in Tom Doyle then, out on that frozen road, wrapped in a grown man's coat. 2 years of standing guard, 2 years of being the man, 2 years of waiting for the cold to come. And instead, a man had ridden into the dark to bring him home and told him he was wanted. Tom Doyle put his face against Jonah Rourke's shoulder and cried, the way a boy cries who has been carrying a grown man's load for far too long and has finally been allowed to set it down. And Jonah let him and said nothing and carried him home through the cold. Meg was at the door when they came, and she took Tom into her arms and wept over him. And then she looked at Jonah Rourke over her son's head, and Meg understood, at last, that the counting was never going to come. This was the night it should have come, the night 4 children became a boy lost in the snow, the exact kind of night that had sent every other man reaching for his hat. And Jonah Rourke had ridden into it without a thought, and brought her boy home, and called him wanted. A man does not do that for a sum he is looking to be rid of. A man does that for family. Later, when Tom was warm and asleep, and the younger ones were settled, Meg found Jonah by the fire, and she tried to thank him, and the words would not come right, because they were too big. And Jonah Rourke said, "You don't need to thank me for going after my own, Mrs. Doyle." And Meg heard the words "my own," and understood that Jonah had stopped counting her children as hers alone some time ago, and that somewhere in the filling of the chairs, without anyone deciding it out loud, the 4 children Meg had carried to his gate like a debt had become, to Jonah Rourke, simply his. The talk that mattered most came a few nights after Tom ran, when the house had settled and the fright had passed, and Meg Doyle finally said out loud the thing she had carried since the gate. Meg came to Jonah by the fire, and Meg said, "I have to tell you why I counted them at you that first day. Why I said 4 before you could even say hello." And Meg told him. She told him about the counting men. She told him about the widower with the good farm who had stood up from her table and reached for his hat and said 4 is a great many children that aren't a man's own. She told him about learning to say the number first, at the gate, to flinch before she could be struck. "I have believed, for 2 years," Meg said, "that my children are the reason no one will have me, that I am a fine enough woman, -4, and that the 4 always wins. I came to your gate already sure you would count them and send us off. I have been waiting all winter for you to do it. I did not know how to stop waiting." And Jonah Rourke listened to all of it. And then Jonah told Meg the thing he had never told anyone, the thing about the table and the 6 chairs. "I built this house when I was young and certain," Jonah said. "I built it wide, for a big family. And I built that table out there, out of good oak, with 6 chairs, because I grew up an only child in a quiet house, and I swore my house would be loud. I married a woman named Helen, and Helen and our first baby both died the same winter night, being born, and I buried the 2 of them together, and I came home to a house I had built for a family, with a table built for 6, and I sat down at it alone." Jonah's voice was low. "For 9 years, Mrs. Doyle, I have sat down to supper at a table with 6 chairs and filled one. 9 years of 5 empty chairs. You came to my gate and counted your 4 children like they were a debt you were ashamed of. And all I could see was that you had, walking up my road, almost exactly enough people to fill my empty chairs at last." Then Jonah Rourke said the words that Meg Doyle would keep for the rest of her life. "You keep doing a sum where the children are what you subtract. I need you to hear how I do the same sum. You, and Tom, and Katie, and Danny, and little Rose, that is 5. 5 people to fill 5 chairs that have sat empty for 9 years. And then there is me, and that makes 6, and my table was built for exactly 6. Do you understand what you brought to my gate, Meg? You did not bring me 4 mouths I would have to feed. You brought me the family this house was built for, and then had to wait 9 years to meet. There is not a man alive who wanted your 4 children more than I do, because there is not a man alive who has sat as long as I have, at a table built for a family, with all the chairs empty." It was the first time Jonah had called her Meg, and not Mrs. Doyle, and Meg Doyle, who had not let herself cry in front of anyone in 2 years, who had held her chin up through the funeral, and the counting men, and the long cold winter, finally put her face in her hands, and wept at Jonah Rourke's fire. Not from sorrow, from the terrible relief of setting down a sum she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was a choice. "I do not know how to stop counting them as a debt," Meg said, through her hands. "I have done it so long." And Jonah said, gently, "Then let me do the counting from now on. I am better at it than you are. I keep coming out at 6, and 6 is exactly right." And Meg Doyle laughed, a wet and broken and real laugh, and let herself, for the first time since a man last reached for his hat at her table, begin to believe that this one never would. Jonah did not grab at her or rush her. Jonah waited, and when Meg had cried herself quiet, Jonah said only, "We can be married whenever you are ready, no sooner. But I would take it kindly if you would stop keeping those children quiet on my account. This house was built for noise. Let it be as loud as it likes." And Meg, who had spent a winter making 4 children take up as little room as they could, laughed again and let them, from that night on, be as loud as the house had always wanted. Meg Doyle and Jonah Rourke were married that spring, in the little church at Prairie Grove, with 4 children in the front pew, and the minister said afterward that he had never seen a groom look so much like a man who had waited his whole life for exactly this. The chairs filled. All of them. Rose grew up believing Jonah's elbow was her rightful place at the table, and never sat anywhere else. Katie's slates gave way, in time, to real paper and real pencils, and Jonah kept every drawing she ever made, in a box that grew heavy over the years. Danny became his father's shadow around the ranch, and could ride and rope by the time he was 10, and Jonah told anyone who would listen in town that the boy was a natural, and Danny glowed under it the way a boy glows. And Tom the eldest, the one who had stood guard for 2 years and run into the snow rather than be counted. It took Tom the longest, because trust that is hard won is trust that holds. But there came a night, near a year on, at supper, when Tom passed Jonah the bread without being asked, and said, "Easy as anything, here, Pa," and then went red, because he had not planned to say it. And Jonah Rourke had to look very hard at his plate for a moment before he could answer, because a man does not like to let his eldest boy see him undone by a single word passed with the bread. Remember the table, built for 6, that had sat with 5 chairs empty for 9 years. It never sat empty again. And in time there came a 6th child, a baby of Meg and Jonah's own, a little boy they named Michael, after the good miner who had been these children's first father, because Jonah Rourke was not a man who needed to crowd out one love to make room for another. And when baby Michael came, Meg laughed and said they had run clean out of chairs, all 6 full at last, and Jonah said he would build a longer table, and he did, and then he had to fill that one too, over the years, which suited him fine. And sometimes, of an evening, Jonah Rourke would sit at the head of his long, loud, crowded table, surrounded by more children and more noise than he had ever dared hope for, and Meg would catch him just looking at all the filled chairs, with an expression on his face like a man hearing music he had once given up on ever hearing again. And Meg Doyle, who had once stood at that man's gate and counted her 4 children like a debt she was ashamed to confess, would remember the sum she used to do, the one that always came out at 4 and always came out at not enough. And she would look at the crowded table and do the new sum, the one Jonah had taught her, and it always came out the same now, full, every chair, more than enough, which is the only arithmetic Meg came to understand that a home was ever meant to keep.